All right, let's try this again, shall we? I think you should now be able to hear me. With everything else, I apologize. Coming into this live stream, I had a complete plan for the day, and of course, as life happens, was not able to uh, come to the table quite as I had hoped. I hope. Can you hear me now, Jason? If you're still here, I think I should have sound. Um, Regretfully, I found out this morning that my wife had a positive COVID exposure, and so we've been handling and managing a lot of that. And that kind of took up much of my time. And so I slide in here a little more live than I normally expect or like for a live stream. So, but as I had in the header for today, I want to talk a little bit about vermicomposting, share an activity for families to connect with the natural world now that we're into the winter months, and then share with you what the 2022 schedule is going to look like for the show and where some of those pieces are, especially as I continue to receive requests for people to be featured on the show as guests, and then of course to take any listener Q&A along the way, while wishing you a happy holidays and Merry Christmas until the new year. So, vermicomposting came up because one of the Patreon members of the podcast community, John, in a recent Ask Me Anything, asked about whether or not I had had anyone on the show who is producing vermicast or vermicompost at a commercial scale. And I don't think that I have had anybody. I couldn't remember it. I couldn't recall. I myself did vermicomposting on a household scale and really enjoyed it. And so thought I would share some of that with you and some resources. And yeah, just get into that because it was something that I really, really enjoyed. And then, yes, look for someone who practices at that scale for a future interview. When it comes to vermicomposting, I love it so much because it's something that works on a home scale very effectively for turning our kitchen scraps and kitchen waste into something that is usable for our gardens, whether we're doing something in an urban space where it's, pots on a balcony, or whether we have rows and rows of garden and are looking for something to bolster some of our heavy feeders. It also works really well, the castings from worms, to make worm tea. And I really like it. And once you purchase the worms, they are life that you can keep alive for a long time and have generation after generation after generation of worms and just keep them living for years and years and years, making it very economical as well. I did an interview in October of 2022 with Matt Arthur about bokashi, and I really found that super appealing as a way to process all kinds of home scale food waste, but was a little thrown off of it and a bit concerned because of needing the microbes that handle that waste and being able to keep them going, and whether or not it would be something that we may have to purchase repeatedly. And so I still recommend first and foremost vermicomposting as an in-home, home-scale composting system. It's just pretty straightforward and easy. You have a decent bin, usually about 1 square foot of surface area per person in the family per day, or in the household per day. So I used some under bed bins that were, those Rubbermaid bins that are about 8 inches high. They're about 5 to 6 square feet on top, and filled that full of damp newspaper. And then the worms that you use for vermicomposting are particular. They are usually red wigglers, which if you're someone who fishes, you may have found in your bait shop, or like my old Bass Pro had a bait dispenser outside. And very often the worms that are used for fishing are red wigglers. And so that would be a source where you could get them. if you wanted to go looking. The other is that there are people who sell red wigglers for you, and you can just get those. They're, last time I checked, they were around $20 or $25 for enough to start your bin and get going. And I usually recommend starting with that smaller amount in a smaller bin. Fill it full of damp newspaper. Get your worms in there. They're going to start eating that newspaper. As you get kitchen scraps, which should all be fruits and vegetables, you don't want to put any meats or fats in there. And then you just, every once in a while, open the top of your worm bin, lift up your newspaper, put a little bit of your food under, put it back down, and then the worms will just eat that. And then from time to time, for me, it was usually every month or so, I would go in, take out about half of the bin as those castings from the worms as they've eaten all this stuff up. Take any of the really big chunks, put those back in, and let the worms continue to work. Then if you want, you can take your worms, move, and rather than just buy a lot of worms all at once, get your first small bin started, and then as you're pulling out your worm castings, you can move some of your worms to a new bin and start that new worm colony. And it was something that I really enjoyed it. And then as an environmental educator, worms were a lot of fun. They were always involved and engaged in their life cycle. So once the worms got established, like 4 or 6 weeks in, I could go in and find their eggs, which was really neat. And as they started to kind of puff up and grow, you could see the little worm in there before they would hatch. And part of the healthy worm bin is to include some eggshells. Once you start adding food products, I'd make some eggs, I'd take those, rinse the shells out, put them in with the worms, and they would use those as spaces very often for me to find the eggs that they ate, the eggs that they laid. And when I was sorting out the castings, very often that's where I would find the worms bundled up. And just, it was a lot of fun. And taking them to nature centers and doing presentations with them, it was always entertaining because the children in the group would come up and they would want to touch the worms and handle them and hold them. And I could just watch the parents in the background get kind of squeamish and step away and be like, no, I'm not really comfortable with that. But then when I started talking about how you could use this in the garden, or ask, does anybody here fish? And they'd raise their hands. I'm like, this is a great way to, if you're someone who likes to fish with worms, to establish your own collection of readily available worms for fishing there. The way that, once you start your colony of worms, that you can trade them with people, that you can manage the bins in different ways. That what I really liked about them is that there was never any kind of a rotting vegetation smell using vermicompost or worms. It always just smelled kind of like damp vegetation. That smell you get when you're walking around and kicking up leaves in the forest, or you're going through the fridge and you find a bag of salad mix that is gone just a little off. That's the kind of smells that you get out of a vermicomposting system. And I never got anything super, super strange about it. The only concern that you may want to be aware of is that because the bins are humid, they are moist, they do attract other insects and life from around. So it was not uncommon to open the top of my worm bin and find some things that weren't worms. A couple of beetles a few times, definitely some small spiders. And so that's something that you may want to just be aware of. The worms do need air, so it's best if they're not in a completely airtight container. And so keeping them good and happy and healthy and alive. So and then if this is something that you do want to do, like I said, no fats, no dairy, no meat with your worms, largely fruits and vegetables, but you don't want to put any citrus or citrus peels in either, as there is a chemical in citrus that can harm the worms. And with that, if you'd like to really get deep with vermicomposting on that home scale and learn more, the book that I always go back to is, let me get the Oh, yes, Jason shares in the chat that that they tried it and the worms attempted a great exodus across the garage, and that few of them made it. Yes, red wigglers are small, and so if they do encounter a dry environment, they may try. If they encounter the right environment, they may try to make a break for it, and in doing so, are not likely to make it. They are also specific to a. I don't have it off the top of my head, but they are specific um, to certain bioregions and so do not do well everywhere. They are definitely something that you would want to keep inside unless you have a large insulated container that is not likely to freeze solid during the winter outside. That's where I always like having them indoors. I kept my worms in the, um, even though they were under bed bins, they were thin enough to stack, and so they were kept in the bathroom closet. And occasionally we would find some one that wanted to escape, but that environment seemed to work out pretty well. And yes, that may be something about making sure that you find the right environment for them in your home. They do prefer it to be dark, but if you have a space and find that you have a lot of escapees, you may want to move them again to find a place where the outside world is less hospitable than the warm, damp comfort of their worm bin. The book that introduced me to vermicomposting is Mary Applehoff's Worms Eat My Garbage, and was absolutely fantastic. Simple little book, lots of information in it, easy and inexpensive to pick up and read through in an afternoon and learn everything you need to get started. Much more detail than the little introduction that I provided here. Another book that has been recommended to me is The Worm Farmer's Handbook by Rhonda Sherman. That's from Chelsea Green, friends of the show. That is not one, though, that I, as I say, am personally familiar with, but one that was recommended that you may also want to check out, or if you want to get a bit deeper after reading Mary's book. ChelseaGreen.com if you want to find that. Looks like the retail on it is $29.99 US. And yeah, that's a 7x10 book, so it's not only a larger size book, but it's also 256 pages, which I think is about twice the size of Mary's book. Even with that, yeah, I would definitely recommend Mary's first and foremost. It's the one that's gotten a ton of people started and running. And then, yeah, if you want to dig in further and go from the small scale to something bigger, once you've learned the ropes and handled the basics, then definitely check out Rhonda's book. Again, that's from chelseagreen.com. So, from vermicomposting, the next piece that I wanted to get into is for the families in the audience. In addition to vermicomposting, which I do think is a great activity for families and children, and a way to show the everything gardens within the permaculture sense, something that I always deeply enjoyed and was reminded of this week is the beauty of the nighttime sky. And that for many of us living in cities and elsewhere, we may not be able to see a deep dark. But even without that, this time of year is a beautiful time to be outside. For those of us who are in temperate climates where it's winter and getting colder, that we can experience those temperatures and understand those variations throughout the year rather than just being able to live in the comfort of our climate control. And so for families who are in the global north and experiencing winter right now, to during the holiday season pick a night and plan it. Get your family together, get your hot cocoa, get your blankets, find your warm clothes, and then head outside. Whether your backyard, your front yard, just anywhere you can look up and see some stars. And make an event out of it so it's something that you can remember, pass those drinks around, cover your laps with the blankets, and make a star map. Whether that's with chalk in a driveway or pen and paper, if you need to bring some flashlights to look from time to time, take a little while to look up at the sky and observe it. Watch as the stars move across the heavens. Find the patterns that are being made. If someone in your family is knowledgeable about constellations, then have them point them out to you. Then as you draw your stars, perhaps draw your stars, wherever that is, to connect those dots. Fill in the constellations. Or if you don't know them, find new ones. What are some new representations that are there? How can you imagine the sky under a different mythology or a different story? If you're reading a particular children's book together, and there are signs and symbols or characters in that book, who do you see in the stars above you where you are? If you have family members who live, across the country or in a different part of the world, see if you can have them take a picture of their same night sky on the same night that you're out observing the stars, and send it to you, and see how those stars are different from where you are. And as you gaze upon the heavens, open the rest of your senses. Feel where the breezes blow during this time of year. In this area around Christmas, when do you feel the cold air blow, and where does it come from? As you're looking up at the sky, what do you hear? What is around you? What are the sounds and life that fill your world? And as you have this map that you make of the heavens, what else do you experience? And make some notes on the page with you. And enjoy that time together outside, enjoying the weather for what it is, whatever it might be, taking in the space where you live, wherever that is, whether it's a city or country or somewhere in between, and how that stands out or how it's different. And then, if you'd like to, and you're watching this in a couple of days, let's say the new year, if you've watched this and you've engaged in this activity, on New Year's Eve, I will go outside and see if I can take a picture of the stars over my head. And if you're able to, go out on New Year's Eve and do the same, and then share them with me, send them with me. Let's see what the night sky looks like where we are. And you can send those to my email address if you'd like, show@thepermaculturepodcast.com, and I'll be happy to share those with the viewers and listeners in the future, and we can all participate in this. If no one else does, that's okay too. I will go ahead and take a picture of my night sky and share it as part of the next live stream and our next live conversation. Which also, yes, I should also make a star map of my own that night, not just the picture, and see what drawings I can make and look for those mythologies other than the Greek or Roman and what I can put there. And yeah, I will be back in a few weeks with the next live stream, and yeah, I'll probably toss another activity like this in our conversation as well, if you're one of the folks who's interested in children and permaculture and these kinds of activities. We'll just kind of keep that rolling. So from there, this is where I wish I had a nice title card I could transition us. The last few weeks of the year have required that I spend time with my friends and family. There's a lot that's been going on behind the scenes, and people who reached out and had a need for my friendship, my companionship, my support. And when I put together the schedule for what would be the 12th year of the show from October 2021 until October 2022, where I committed to 24 live streams and 45 regular episodes of the show, I made it that so that I could still work in some downtime. And I didn't expect that to happen all at once, but that there'd be a little bit of time here and a little bit of time there where I would take some time to help the people in my life, as it was needed in case there were any kind of emergencies or anything. But it's been just a couple of weeks where it's just been one thing after another, as if the pandemic weren't enough. As a result of that, that has pushed back a number of the projects and plans that I had been working on over the last several months. Some of the things that I shared with you during the show. including getting out the conversations with Della Z. Duncan and Chris Salisbury in December. So those are pushed back into January. It looks like the next new episode is going to be a conversation with Renard Turner about his idea of New Age agrarianism in partnership with Future Harvest, because I'll be covering their conference in the middle of January. And so Renard is one of the keynote speakers there. And I'm really looking forward to not only sharing the conversation, which was a deep dive into the issues of race and land access in the United States and his particular perspective as an independent black farmer in America and what needs to happen for farming to really grow among the black community. But all that together means that this is kind of my last production for 2022. For Patreon supporters, I shared the last weekly update yesterday, and so I'm going to be moving into my end of year retreat, my holiday, starting tomorrow. But in 2022 for the show, we're really in good shape for everything else that I said that I wanted to accomplish this year. I've got enough interviews recorded to see the show and the release schedule well into really like August right now, across a variety of topics and all kinds of things for us to cover. There's the series with Rosemary Morrow coming up, which is all completely recorded and ready to go, and I'm super excited to share with you. So all of that should be on time, and I'm still expecting to hit that 45 episode marker that I was planning, as well as the 24 live streams. I may actually increase the number of these and make them more routine, but we'll see where things go. As always, I don't want to commit to everything, which is far too often the case, but there are a lot of conversations with some of my colleagues. There are questions that we receive that never seem to fit in our regular shows. So how do we talk about those things? And so there's some bonus content for the show coming from Dan Palmer and Oliver Gaucher, where we're going to be just addressing some questions within the permaculture community, and I'll be releasing those as some short episodes in 2022. But as I say, the core content of the podcast, really until August, maybe even September at this point, is mostly recorded. A couple conversations in January because of some folks who couldn't do it before the end of the year. But once that's done, the calendar's pretty much together. And so I'll be switching to production and just editing, and getting out as much as I can. With that schedule, I have a live event coming up in September of 2022, which is a permaculture retreat in Asheville, North Carolina, where I will be running a course on ecological literacy and design at Earthaven. I've reached out to Natalie Bogwalker of Wild Abundance to join us as a guest instructor, and registration for that is currently open and available with my retreat partner, Learn from Travel. So if you are interested in joining me for a retreat September 7th to the 11th, 2022, we still are following COVID and tracking that, so there may be, we are planning as best as we can to hold this then as a live event. And but that's September 7th to the 11th, 2022. This is my ecological design and literacy material, which forms the core skills that are required for a permaculture design course. If you're someone watching this and you've never taken a PDC, definitely come join us. This is a great way to start. Because it is my fundamentals, it's about 24 hours of instruction over the days that we're together, and then that is the primer. Then, if you would like to at some time in the future, come back and take a permaculture practicum with me to complete the rest of your PDC. For someone else who's a permaculture practitioner, already have a PDC, I welcome you to join us as a space to get together with a bunch of other permaculture practitioners. Get involved, be engaged in the conversation, share your thoughts as we look at permaculture education through this lens of ecological literacy first and foremost. and learning about the landscape before we even talk about permaculture. We'll be walking the land, digging into the ideas of what makes for a healthy landscape or not. What are we looking at when we see the woods of western North Carolina around Asheville? How do those differ from what were there historically? And how does that all tie together into our understanding of and vision for design? And from there, take that kind of knowledge and pull it together and build on top of that to establish a core understanding of permaculture and the models that go with it. So yes, anybody who would like, I welcome you to join us for this retreat. You can find out more about that at learnfromtravel.com/permaculture. I'm also then at the end of March going to be, again, crossing my fingers, I am still COVID cautious, to go down to Asheville to meet up with Natalie so that we can talk in person about a bit about this course, as well as to do an in-person video interview with her, and a site tour of Wild Abundance. So looking to produce not only the audio that comes out of that as an episode for the show, but also 2 videos, one of the interview with thinking of like a multiple camera perspective, and some other things to see what I can accomplish moving forward. Going back to that idea, like I had said before, about wanting to do like permaculture documentaries, thanks to a very generous end of year angel investor, there's some gear that I've wanted to get for these kinds of tours that I'll be able to pick up and put into first practice when I go visit Natalie and do this farm tour and conversations with her. And I'm looking forward to doing that and sharing it with you. Yeah, so that should be fun. And then also while I'm in Asheville, there are some other permaculture folks that I'm going to try to connect with. What of that may make it on air or not, I'm not sure. Some of them are scheduled to be private conversations, others may wind up being public, but that I'm really excited about. Yeah, and then the other thing that's on my mind at the moment is that my class schedule for 2022 is pushed back a bit. I had thought that I was going to dive into the homeschooling, the permaculture and homeschooling enrichment program at the beginning of the year. I'm pushing that back until the first quarter, but we'll be sharing that with folks throughout the year as that model comes together, so that anybody who's interested can participate. As I've shared elsewhere, there's a website and Patreon and some of the other stuff coming with that. But the homeschooling and permaculture enrichment program, the first quarter of that will begin April 1st, 2022. Enrollment is likely to end the 1st of March, but yeah, I'll share more information on that as that comes together. Oh, with the in-person retreat, we are doing an early bird special for that, discounted pricing and some other pieces. Mostly pricing is discounted if you sign up before the end of January 2022. I'll be sharing some of that on the podcast as we go, but if you'd like to go ahead and see that and all the details and reserve your space, you can do so again at learnfromtravel.com/permaculture. I will be teaching a complete online permaculture design course next year. I know that with where things are, my life in this space is likely to continue to remain virtual for some time, just with where the world is and where I'm at, that it makes more sense and makes this education more accessible to do it in a virtual way. And so that will be launching July 1st with an ecological literacy and design class, which will run for 6 weeks, from July 1st until the middle of August, which again is that core idea of how we read the landscape. And we'll start with landscape work first and foremost, and then move into the permaculture pieces. And that's for anyone who really wants to learn about permaculture and apply it to their lives. That you will have all of those tools by the time you are done with that, as opposed to needing to go through an entire 72-hour permaculture design course where you, because the way that it's outlined, you will learn a lot of things that are not necessary for practicing permaculture as an individual, but are important if you want to engage in permaculture as a professional, or if you will be moving through a variety of different landscapes in your life. If you figure you're going to be living, East Coast temperate your entire life, then definitely come join me for the Ecological Literacy in Design. If you want to take your permaculture further or want to call your professional work permaculture, you will need to complete a permaculture design course. And so the second half, or really second 2/3 of what I'll be offering for the PDC will be a permaculture practicum. The exact focus for how to model permaculture in that space will be determined by the students who are engaged as we get to that, because the permaculture practicums are topic-based in order to frame the work of permaculture around it and have examples that we will be working with throughout the experience. And I'm looking at the permaculture practicum beginning after the in-person retreat in the middle of September, likely September 15th. Again, though, I'll be sharing sign-up and enrollment information about that in the weeks and months ahead. So also with this kind of needing to step back for a few weeks, even as we return to the new year, as I said, I am looking at beginning with the interview with Renard Turner as our first. I'll release a 2022 State of the Podcast episode, which is, if you're watching this or follow the show on Patreon at patreon.com/permaculturepodcast, you likely will have heard much of what I'll be sharing. It'll just be a little bit more concise and in further detail. From there, we'll have an interview guest hosted by Karin Olson with Della Z. Duncan, an introduction to an organization that I've been helping to develop over the last year and a half, the Regenerative Media Alliance, a conversation with Derek Gow, the UK reintroduction specialist, about the act of reintroduction and his work with beavers. Then we'll have Eric Tonesmeyer back on the show after a number of years, and it was so good to talk with him. I'm really excited to share the conversation about alley cropping. And then Chris Salisbury for Wild Nights Out. That'll get us well into the beginning of the year, and then start to share the other interviews that are coming up as I continue to work on some of the other pieces, record the conversations with the folks on radical self-care. So we'll have another series in 2022 similar to the one on, similar in style, though different in subject, to the one in this year on permaculture, land, and land access. Throughout this entire process, though, even though I've got all this material to work with, I certainly want to hear from you if you have any questions or ideas. In the moment, if you'd like to drop anything into the chat while we're still live to answer on air in this last live stream, please do. As there's always a bit of a delay, I'll give that a second. But also, if you're interested in having anything addressed in an upcoming live stream or an episode of the show, if you are one of the pod's Patreons, then please drop your questions in an AMA thread, because that helps to launch these conversations and provides a topic to start with. Then we can build on top of that. If there is anything that you'd like covered on an episode of the show, or something for me to address, yeah, definitely get in touch with me. I always, of course, include my contact information, so you can email me, show@thepermaculturepodcast.com. Drop an email, 717-827-626. Wait, no. Drop an email to show@thepermaculturepodcast.com. Send a text or call 717-827-6266. If you're watching this broadcast later, feel free to drop something in the comments. I do check YouTube Studio usually at least once a week to see if there's anything new there. And I'm more than happy to do everything that I can to help you on your way with your permaculture journey. I just need to know where you're at and what you're doing so that we can grow this, continue it, and take it further. So thank you for those of you who have been in and out of the conversation today. I really appreciate it, and it's been fun. Oh, Jason, I'm very interested in why permaculture is so white. The conversation with Renard does get into a lot of this because we deal with like systemic pieces within the conversation. But what I've been exploring when it comes to like the race issue within permaculture is the model for how permaculture was taught for so long made it really inaccessible unless you had resources. And systemically, regretfully, it's white folks who have those resources, particularly in the spheres where David and Bill were accessible, where their books were being published. They wrote in English. As far as I know, they didn't work on getting translations of their material out there early on. That Bill was just going to wherever he could teach a class and was invited that would, pay his way. And so that was people who had money. I mean, my own experience being white and middle class, I had time to take a permaculture design course, or I had the money, but I didn't have both. Permaculture design courses throughout most of the 90s and early to mid 2000s were all about like these beautiful fancy retreats somewhere around the world where if you were an American, you would need a passport to get to, which is an expense. You would need to fly there. You need to be able to take 2 to 3 weeks off of work to go. And yeah, I just think permaculture kind of priced its way out of being accessible for people. And that new models and the models of sliding scales and other things didn't really start to occur until, the 2010s was the first place that I encountered it. But I mean, I discovered permaculture in 1998. The summer of 1998 when I was working at the US Coast Guard. And I followed permaculture for 12 years before I finally found a PDC that I could take. And, yeah, I think, I think about it from that perspective for so long, was needing the time and money to take a 2-week course, and then the expense that was associated with it. It's something that I still struggle with because in order to make a class small enough for me to show up for my students in the way that I would like to, for me to be able to include the guest instructors that I want to and make sure that everybody is paid for doing their work, a permaculture design course at a few $100s until you've got it all built up is hard to do. Or it's non-interactive, or there are just all kinds of issues with it. And when I've been putting together my pricing for 2022, it's as low as I can comfortably go for everything, because I know the amount of time that goes into producing a good class and spending quality time with students. It was one of the pieces that came out of my teacher training, is that every hour that you present to your students, you're looking at anywhere between 1 to 20 hours of preparation for your presentation. What I go through for, when I am better prepared for an off-the-cuff live stream that begins with 15 to 20 minutes talking about a subject before moving into Q&A, I can easily spend 2 or 3 hours getting my materials together, getting my outline together, and that's something where I'm usually talking about something that I'm pretty familiar with and something that's off the cuff, let alone trying to do it at just a high level and a professional level. Makes it hard. I also think though that permaculture is so white because of its anti-academic stance for so long. There's Bill Mollison writes about the academics fallacy of I think therefore I act. And so that has kept permaculture out of academic circles for so long, where students have access to student aid or loans or grants to pay for it. With trying to find models that people can do this and actually afford it, it goes back to just accessibility, and that permaculture prices its way out of many people's pocketbooks. Jason, I've been accused of class reductionism, but boy howdy does the correlation of class seem to come up a lot when we dig into racial inequality. Well, you'll hear more about that in the conversation with Renard Turner. We do definitely talk about that. And yeah, as I say to Renard in that conversation, even as somebody who reads about this, who tries to be educated about it, it can be difficult to understand just how broad and systemic it is. And that ultimately, I would say that the issue is about hierarchy, but that in the state of Europe, the United States, the Anglosphere, any place that the English or Europeans have ever had a colony, that it is a racial issue because it is white folks who have had access to resources and have not been oppressed in the same way. Though I still point, as I say, I still point back to hierarchy. That, yeah, that it is really just the continued systemic oppression of people that has kept permaculture largely white. That seems to be changing from conversations I've had with folks in South America and Africa, where people in those cultures and communities are really taking these ideas and running with it in ways that we can't in the Anglosphere or Europe. That it is financially difficult for the people in those spaces to do so. But I'm also finding that because permaculture has been so white for so long, that it is agroecology or alley cropping or some of these other techniques that might work under the lens of permaculture that these different communities are using instead of permaculture. Where I still look at permaculture as the umbrella that many of these different ideas fit under, and is still the main way to accomplish most of our ecological and food security goals. That this is the space that we learn some of the theory and ideals, and then it's the application of some of these other techniques too. But I've looked at ways to make my work more accessible by having the back catalog of the show turned into transcripts that I could then send to people who are in country to take the transcripts to translate into their native language to use for permaculture education. And it is, for me to get the podcast archives transcribed is 5 figures, easily. Even going with like bulk discounts and some other things, it is 5 figures to get the catalog translated. Even to, or I should say, I apologize, transcribed. Even if I were to go through and select like the core lessons from the show or the core episodes and get them, it is still thousands of dollars. And I mean, that's a hurdle. Then once that is transcribed, to get that into the hands of a translator in country and pay them is still a few $1,000s more. And that's, just the expense of trying to do a lot of this work is where many of us are hamstrung. We know what we want to do, we know what we want to accomplish, and how to get more of this material in the hands of people who will use it, but doing it is just, it can be difficult and expensive some ways. I would much rather do a remote permaculture design course for someone in Africa or South America, where I'm sitting here in my office and, presenting and lecturing and showing slides, and then working with an in-country translator to help facilitate the course. Would be, that'd be a great way to work on this, or to get a group of people who would be interested, who can speak English as well as their native tongue, do a permaculture design course for them with me, teach them how to do this, support them afterwards, so that then they can be teaching natively in their own country. Like, there are just a lot of different ways that trying to unwhiten permaculture, there's just lots of options, but how do we do it? Um, and yeah, so yeah, it's something that I continue to turn over because I want permaculture to be accessible. I don't want it to be behind a paywall. I don't want it to be something hard to find, but then there's the realities of capitalism and needing to feed ourselves, and that still makes it hard too. Um, but yeah, Jason, the comment about academia, it's just the piece that I turn around to it is that there are the support structure that is there allows a lot of different ways for people to join in and engage. And I if permaculture were taught at more universities, then people who are just at going to college, they can hear about this class on permaculture and take it and learn about this without ever needing to be exposed to it. And it's just another alley or avenue, I think, for putting this information out in the world. But I've also gotten pushback from people when discussing permaculture in an academic setting because it's like, well, Bill didn't want that. And I'm kind of past the point where I care what Bill would have wanted. He gave us the information, it's out in the world, and now it's being used by people everywhere. And there are generations of people beyond. We are now generations past Bill. And so, not only is it about remixing the permaculture design course, but making it fit the world that we're in. Um, and not keeping some of these other pieces sacred. And, David is still here with us, and I'm happy for all of his writings and everything he's got that he's provided with us. But we're in a space where we can do a lot more with it than continuing to hold on to these like relics of form from the past, or because somebody said something 35 or 40 years ago that's the way that it's supposed to happen. Come on. Like, most of us in our professions, whatever we do, we're not pulling from information that is 35 or 40 years old if we want to be taken seriously or act as a professional. When I was in IT, I had to know what the latest forms, what the latest software was that my users had. If there was an operating system update, I was learning about that operating system when I went to graduate school and studied resource management and ecology. The first thing that my ecology professor said is that what you're learning today isn't going to be the same in next year, let alone in 5 or 10. So this is just a starting point to provide you the basics that you're going to build on. One of my professors many years ago, when I studied geology, talked about the fact that plate tectonics was not a thing when he was earning his PhD. It was this concept that people had started to speak of, but like nobody really knew. And he walked us through one of those classes. It was an upper level elective. There were like 12 of us in the class. He walked us through how much geology had changed since he became a professor. I think it may have also been because it was his last year and he was going to retire after that class. But like, he walked us through what his career was like and how much it had changed. And that's where permaculture is. We just need to keep changing and adapting and doing different. And that will help make it more accessible. And for people who are able and willing to step up, donate to a class so that the teachers can offer scholarships or free spaces. If you're someone like, honestly, that's where also a lot of my pricing comes in, is so that when it comes to classes and things, is so that if someone can't afford it, they can still show up and everybody who's involved gets paid. The students receive a high quality education. And so, yeah, when you see some of those prices, know that you may be supporting somebody else's attendance. If you're wondering about whether or not you can afford it, reaching out and asking if there's a sliding scale or a discount or a scholarship. There's just so much that we can do, but I feel that there's been a lot of gatekeeping when it comes to permaculture to get it to the point where it is, and that now that we're trying to go in different directions, a lot of that old dinosaur thinking is still continuing, and we need to knock it off. It's just, there's no place for it. I have no time or patience for it anymore, and it's a large part of why I don't engage in the politics of permaculture. I don't have time for somebody who has had me at their house to have dinner to say, oh, well, what you're doing is not permaculture. Really? Really? Nah, it is. I'm just doing this in a way that you don't understand, that doesn't necessarily make sense to you. Permaculture, as even Bill wrote about it, wasn't in the landscape. So if that's the argument you're going to make, go pound sand. Um, if your permaculture has to be pure in a particular way because of some bias that goes towards, your anti big ag or big pharma or anything else, come on. Like, David even writes about using narrow spectrum herbicides in permaculture, principles and pathways beyond sustainability. We are in a period of transition and crisis, and we need to find the tools that care for Earth, cares for people, and allows us to care for each other, that are not bound up in dogma, and just continue to move forward. We know how to grow food for people, but why can't people grow their own food? It's not because of seeds, it's not because of GMOs, it's not big ag, it's not anything else like that. It's because people don't have access to land to grow on. People don't have mentors who they can go to who are doing what it is that they are interested in doing in the culture that they live in. And I mean that within the culture that they live in, not the society, not the country, but the space that they're in. Like, I grew up thinking that a large farm was a couple hundred acres because that's what my grandfather had. But you compare that to ranches that are tens of thousands of acres, I can't even imagine that. But like when I talked with Renard Turner, it's about how there aren't enough black ranchers and black farmers working on a broad scale on hundreds or thousands of acres. And because of this idea that, well, urban agriculture is in the cities. Well, why are we talking about urban agriculture? We're talking about urban agriculture because that's where black people are. Well, but why are they there, and why don't they have farmers to talk to if they want to aspire to farming? And something that I got into with Renard, I don't remember if it was in the interview or not because we talked for a long time, was that he talks about exposure, and we kind of talk about this idea about being able to dream big enough. And the lesson for today for children in permaculture comes from something that I shared with him during that. And it was when I was I was a teenager then. I had the opportunity to be laying on the deck of a boat 15 miles from the shore of the United States, where the only light around us were the ones that were required on the boat. And it wasn't much. And it was the first time that I could look up into the heavens and see the Milky Way, and see that it wasn't hundreds of stars above me, but an uncountable multitude. And that was a moment for me where I was able to dream bigger. And even though I personally felt so small and insignificant, it opened up my mind in a way that no other experience has. And like, I've sat with people who have gone on mind-opening experiences. I've gone on some of my own, but laying on the deck of that ship, surrounded by some close friends, we were Boy Scouts, and looking up at the sky was one of the pieces that did it for me. And those are the kinds of big experiences that everyone should be able to have. But because of hierarchy and systemic systems, it's not. It's ultimately about, I'm going to reach down to help you up, to keep you where you are. That, yeah, and just continuing to keep the systems as they exist in place. And it just, yeah. I have returned to some of the things that I have lately because this really angers me that this is still happening. How much the systemic forces play into keeping permaculture white, keeping people from the resources that they need, from keeping people from having enough, because it keeps them in their place. And I'm just tired and angry. And, I face this fact that I need to find a way to survive under capitalism while still wanting to do this work, and I haven't quite done that yet. While everything about my being screams that this is the work that matters the most, that this is the way to change lives. And I just can't. Yeah, I don't know how I go back to a life that was knowing this and pulling back in those to those pulling back to a life as it was. I can't, you can't close the door on that, and I can't go back to it. So anyway, these are some of the things that I'm working through as I look at many of my core beliefs. That Christian anarchy has a big piece to play with it. That being raised brethren and coming from a peaceful church has a big part of it. That some as much as I like to fight and practice and go shooting and do martial arts and things like that, that ultimately it's about being militantly a pacifist. Yeah, and pulling all those things together. Anyway, you reach me at a point where this is some of what I'm considering going into the holidays in the next year, and what I continue to meditate on, and how I can, yeah, keep on keeping on and making a difference, even though I have hundreds of letters from people about how much it has changed their lives, but I can't make a living doing it. Living in Northern Virginia, and because of the cost of living, not being able to have a household that can continue to exist on the modest income from the show plus my spouse's, but needing to have a 2-income household, which, yeah, Jason, as you say, much of the system is specifically built to make us feel that way. I mean, I grew up in a household that was 1 income. My wife, my dad was able to work and take care of us, and then my mom only worked when she wanted to. So yeah, it's a weird, nasty thing to recognize that we all feel tired because the world we live in, and the systems that exist, were designed around a nuclear family with 1 person who works and 1 person who has a lot of unpaid labor. And now, doing all that unpaid labor on top of work and everything else that we're in, it's just a mess. And yeah, how do I break from that cycle? And I'm not sure yet. But I continue to work on it. So anyway, as I often do at the end of these, you get me a little philosophical as I think about next steps and how to move through. But before I draw this to a close, does anybody who's in the chat still have any questions, or are you just kind of hanging out with me because it's the last one of the year and you tuned in for a bit? But either way, thank you all for joining me. It's been fun. I like hopping on here and just chatting for a bit and seeing what appears in the chat window and responding as we go. So, yeah, Nathan, I can't imagine having lived in a place where you could see the Milky Way for most of your childhood. I grew up in Hagerstown, Maryland, Western Maryland, and on the edge of the city, and it wasn't super bright like a lot of cities are now, but it was enough that I only saw so many stars. And then it was my father taking me camping into some places that were an hour or 2 from home and starting to see the sky. But then that huge difference, though, being out on that boat so far away from all the light pollution. And yeah, still, like I say, it's almost 30 years later, and I still talk about that experience. And my son has the opportunity to go to the same high adventure camp that I did as a scout here in a couple of years, and I'm hoping. I just found out that there's the possibility I could go with him, and if I can, I'd really like to see him through that same experience because of what a difference it made for me. And also looking for ways that he can have, well, both my children, all children, can have novel experiences that are life-changing and life-expanding. And how do we do that? And that's, part of what I'm working into these, like the homeschooling enrichment stuff, is how can we go back to serving children in a meaningful way? And as I homeschool my son, we talked earlier today about putting together our curriculum to start 2022 after the holidays, what we're going to be getting into. And, I gave him some responsibility to tell me when he was ready to have the phone call, to share what his goals were for where he wanted to go. And then, what was he interested in learning? And we sat down and figured out a way to give him everything that he was looking for. And I continue to feel that the systems in place, not only were they designed to make us feel this way, to keep us in these spaces, but that if anything, it just continues to become even more so over time, because we don't have wages that pay enough for for a, for the majority of people, shall I say. Allow me to rephrase that. You can't live on a single income and raise children. Both parents have to work. And so that makes it even harder to build up and have time to give to children and our family members in a good way. And it makes it harder to, I don't want to say that classroom size is the only problem with modern education, because it's not. But as classes get a little bit bigger, as teachers have a few more students, that's less time that the teacher gets to spend with each student. And so that requires you to change pedagogical approaches. When it comes to standardized testing, the time that's required to develop for those tests, I know that not all teachers want to teach to a test, but I know that there's a certain amount of that's required in order to get the numbers that make sense and help the schools and the school districts. And I don't think that's a conspiracy. I just think, most of the stuff that I'm talking about today, or the concerns that I have, are not conspiracies in any way. They are just observations about where the system is at and the impacts that it's having. I've been examining income for families over the past couple of months after a friend of mine reached out and said that she got a new job and will be materially it will be the largest income figure for her in her life. But when I go back to what I earned my personal buying power when I was delivering pizzas in the 90s is almost twice what her income will be. And that's like, how do we get anything done that way? Or like Sam Sycamore, who used to run in permaculture circles and had a podcast. He's now, if I remember right, he's doing content creation, writing code and things like that, because he was struggling with many of the ideas and things that I did and just wasn't able to stay in these kinds of spaces and keep doing this work. Talked about how when he used to paint houses at $15 an hour, somebody in his life had said that, I bought my way through college painting houses at $15 an hour. It's like, yeah, but that was in the 70s or early 80s. And it's like, we're still paying in real world dollars the same amount. And in a lot of cases, that's for people who have good education, have done everything that is supposed to be right. But as part of a conversation I had in a live stream that Jason, who's been in and out of the chat today, and as part of the conversation we were having, I'm kind of past the point of credentialing in the way that we have. I have an associate's, bachelor's, and master's degree, and I'm applying for jobs that pay single digits sometimes because that's what they are. When I went through graduate school, I had a job lined up that was, $70,000 a year as an environmental educator at a nature center. But then, about 6 months before I graduated, I heard word from the person who wanted to hire me to replace them that their position was being eliminated. And that $70,000 full-time position with benefits and everything else was being turned into 3 part-time positions with no benefits for I think it was $9.50 an hour. And I just, how do we do it? Because it's, and Jason, my thing with the systemic issues is trying to get myself in a headspace so that I can understand it well enough to try to do something about it. I don't know if I'm going to succeed or fail, but I want to try. You know, it's one of the reasons why anarchy, mutual aid, solidarity comes up, because it's always that like, oh well, who's going to pay for this? And it's like, I live my life in a state of anarchy without paying for most of what I do. You know, I go hang out with friends and we just hang out. We most of our lives are lived in a state, as long as we don't have somebody involved in some kind of a hierarchy over us. In the moment to moment of our lives, a lot of us live in kind of a state of anarchy where we can just do whatever without having to worry about money or all these other things. But then being able to live a, I don't even want to say comfortable, but just a decent life is expensive anymore. And yeah, it continues to frustrate me. And that's where I agree, Nathan. I mean, we shouldn't need it, but we do. And how do those of us who are trying to do good work that we're told people want and need and is important and is valuable, but don't get paid for? How do we keep that up? And yeah, but it's similar like with education and adjunct professors. Like, I don't mean that just about me and I'm or anything like that as a podcaster and trying to stay true to what it is that I do, but yeah, all this different part comes in. All these different parts come in, and it's where I wish that like my family and I were in a state where we could live on a little bit of land with some friends and make sure that we were all taken care of materially, that we could feed ourselves off of that property or in relationship with other people and not have to live with the incomes that are currently required in our society. But then I run into that catch that it's we have to own enough land and do all the hard work of figuring out who we want to be on the land with, who is someone who we trust to do the work alongside of us, and all these other pieces to make a vision like that happen. And it's yeah, there's so much, and I haven't answered those questions in the personal space. Um, well, and yeah, Jason, you say that Medicare for all, UBI, and the case for those is clear on every level. But no matter what your values are, but they're non-starters. All the major parties are united that stopping these are the most important thing, and that's been watch much of what I continue to go through is that as I understand the problems and the solutions, that the people who are in power and the politicians who should ideally be doing things for the good of the people and the good of the country aren't. They just aren't. And they won't. Because are they need to perpetuate that power. So is there a way to do this in parallel? And I don't know. As I just kind of talk about this and read your replies and think through it, it's what hurts a lot is that I don't have a solution right now and I want one. And everything just constantly seems to come down to money, 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 people in power, people in power, people in power. And I don't know how to monkey wrench that or put a crowbar into the system and break the gates open so everybody can be free. And it as well, it's Jason, something you said to me, and it's something that I continue to go through as I work with other people. I'd never realized how radical my upbringing was, or how strange it is that I wouldn't want somebody to be beneath me or somebody above me. That my view of humanity is that everyone is of equal meaning. I don't want to say value, because then when we start talking about value, it's easy to start putting numbers on people and things like that are terrible. But like, every human being has meaning. And I wouldn't want to denigrate anyone in any way. And yet, these systems are designed for that. And it's personally, it hurts. It just personally hurts me that people experience that. And to go back to the conversation with Renard Turner, there's someone who he asked me to look up, and I think it's like Louise Elliott. And she talks in classes about, like, classes full of white people. Would you want to live under the same condition as African Americans in the United States? And it's like nobody will raise their hand. And like for me, it's just I don't want anybody to live in those conditions at all. And yeah. This is a lot of what goes on behind the scenes when I'm not editing or reading or writing about something, is just like contemplating my navel and staring at these problems. And it's just, yeah. I don't have any solutions. I don't have any answers, but I do have the ability to keep on keeping on, and that's what I'm going to keep doing. Support mutual aid programs, continue to talk about them on the show, have conversations with guests who are affected by these systemic issues. Bernard Turner was a great conversation. I'd like to have him back on to talk more about this. I want to talk with people who don't have voices in these spaces and get them on the show and elevate it, while still having some of the conversations like those with Eric Tonesmeyer and others that keep people listening. That piece that I posted to Twitter the other day about how the Permaculture podcast is a permaculture, anarchy, pacifism, and mutual aid space holds true. And that's what I'm going to keep aspiring towards, is those values and working on it. So, yeah, if you've made it this far, as I've kind of rambled and continued to respond to the chat, and you have any thoughts on ways that we can break these cycles and do good work, or you're involved in organizations that are truly helping people as an act of solidarity, but not as an act of keeping people in their place, I'd really appreciate hearing it, and continuing these conversations. If this is a discussion that resonated with you, of course, get in touch with me. If this is a conversation that you feel is, totally inappropriate, that there's no such thing as systemic this or systemic that, or that people aren't being downtrodden by the systems that help you feel free, then I don't really want to hear from you, honestly. I don't have time for it. And I'd rather you took the time that you would spend writing a nasty message to me, or a terrible text message, or telling me to, screw off, to do something that matters to your family and your community. Like, you can hate on me and my ideals all you want, but if you're going to take the time to do that, then you're not really helping to build anybody else up either, and I just don't have time for it anymore. Much love to everybody out there. Thank you for joining me for the end of year piece. I will be back in January with the next live stream, January with the new episode and everything else. As always, you can find me at thepermaculturepodcast.com, on Twitter at permaculturepod. Instagram, don't post much there, but there's still a feed. I think it's Permaculture Podcast. And of course, you can always email me, show@thepermaculturepodcast.com. Drop me a text message or phone call, 717-827-6266. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from you and continuing the conversation. My best to all of you until we meet again. So, happy holidays. May you have a joyous new year, while spending each day taking care of yourself, Earth. Yep, I totally hosed that, didn't I? While taking care of Earth, yourself, and each other. Take care, everybody. All my love to you.